This is the last talk of the session before we have the coffee break, and that will be given by Alan Cherry, and he's going to tell us about spikes in Poissonian quantum trajectories.
Thank you, Suzy, for the introduction. I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for giving this opportunity to give this talk, and also for helping finishing this work. This is some work that I've done with Cedric, Abhishek, Aritra, and Raphael. Some of them in the audience. Cedric, unfortunately, could not be with us, but probably is joining online. The thing I would like to talk about are spikes. And so hopefully through this talk, I'll be able to explain what spikes is, why they might be interesting, and what do we do with them. So the framework of our study is essentially quantum systems under continuous time measurements. And you have in the schematic a two-level system that's coupled to some kind of probe, ancillary degree of freedom, and that probe spits out a measurement outcome, which is either 0 or 1. These are essentially Poissonian increments of some signal NT. And if I were to ask what is the evolution of the qubit system state condition on these measurement outcomes, it would be something like a jump stochastic master equations. And in this conference, we already talked about jump stochastic master equations. Pierre Rochon's given a very nice pedagogical lecture, and then also Howard and others also have talked about these equations. And so essentially, the first part of this equation is essentially the Lindblad term that encapsulates the effect of the measurement back action on the average evolution of the system. And the second term, which is what the jump term is basically the drastic change in state that occurs on the qubit when you have a quantum jump, and that corresponds to dn is equal to 1 of the detector outcome. And those are the probabilities that are given. If you were to simulate this particular trajectory on a computer, you would see a movie like this, okay? And this is essentially the time trace of the occupation of the excited state, the first level. And if I were to run this trajectory and just look at various trajectories, I would see essentially that eventually they would converge to one of the levels, either the ground state or the excited state. Now, obviously, I'm talking about states that are specified by some kind of basis. So the measurement operator here, V, is assumed to be diagonalizable, and it has a basis that's linearly independent, orthonormal, and that is what specifies your pointer basis. And the simulation effectively shows that you have some. This is what you call a QND measurement. That eventually it converges to one of those pointer states with the probability given by the Bond rule. And the initial state in the simulation is essentially a statistical mixture, a 50-50 mixture of the ground state and the excited state. So you see how the trajectories go down and how the trajectories go up in this time trace. Now, suppose while writing this equation, obviously I did not take into account the internal dynamics of this qubit, and it may be governed by some kind of Hamiltonian. So if I have to incorporate that term also into the evolution, and suppose that Hamiltonian does not commute with the measurement operator, it would correspond to what we'd call a non-QND measurement. And the time trace then, obviously, you're not satisfying QND anymore. You will see these oscillations that are these then with these jagged edges that correspond to these jumps. And if I were to increase this measurement strength, parameterized by gamma, I would see something like this. So we've talked already about these jumps corresponding to the detector being 1, but there are also these emergent jumps at the strong measurement strength, high measurement strength, which corresponds to transitions between these pointer states 0 and 1. And this process, this jump process, is decorated by these fluctuations which look like aborted jumps and which we term spikes. So this, in essence, is what we'll be focusing on for this whole talk. Now, why do I care about spikes? Why does anyone care about spikes, for that matter? Why should you care about spikes? Well, we are looking at a regime where it's at a strong measurement strength, where you're coupled very strongly to some path or some measurement apparatus, and you're effectively in the quantum Zeno regime. So there's a lot of literature that has been focusing on quantum regime for years now, and this is of interest to that set of problems. And also these fluctuations can affect the time of arrival to a particular state. So between 2 points on a Bloch sphere, if I were to just account for these spikes, those fluctuations can significantly change the time it takes to reach a particular point in this queue. So that's one more operational reason why you would look at spikes. But none of this was as interesting as this third point, which is to us, it was because they show interesting counting statistics. So now I'll make precise in a few minutes what I mean by counting statistics. But before that, I would like to report there were earlier observations of these fluctuations in the strong measurement limit in various simulations, some of them by Mavucci and Wiseman, and Kresser, Barnett, Jeffers, and Gambetta. And these are all effectively looking at these spiking phenomena in simulations, but not exactly focusing on them as much. The real thing that caught our eye was this paper by this Antoine, who's here, where that paper introduced basically this notion of characterizing these spike statistics, these counting statistics of these spikes. And later, Bernardin and collaborators looked at rigorously prove the existence of the spikes and for a wide variety of quantum trajectories of stochastic master equations with Brownian noise. So till all this was focusing on, the latter two papers, two works focused on stochastic master equations with Brownian noise. And so the question we are asking is, what are the counting statistics of spikes for these jump stochastic master equations? Okay, and I'll precisely come to why these counting statistics are super interesting. So here's a simulation of a Poissonian, of a jump stochastic master equation, a quantum trajectory, a jump stochastic master equation. If you zoom in, we see these various maxima, and essentially these spikes are counted by counting these maxima within a particular space-time window from 0 to t, and from time 0 to t, and a spatial domain of A to B. And what we see is that this counting distribution of the number of minima within this particular space-time box, it converges to a Poisson process and for very, very large gamma with an intensity that is given by the integral of, okay, there's a time factor of t that's missing, but with an intensity that's given by the integral of some power law. Oops. Switch it off. No. I think I misclicked. Just 1 second. Yeah, let's come back. Okay, so what's interesting about these statistics is that this particular scaling, this power law scaling, is model agnostic. So you could look at quantum trajectories for a system that is driven by some kind of electromagnetic field, or it would be coupled to some thermal bath, or you could have additional measurements being applied on the system. And you would see in the strong measurement regime these kind of fluctuations, and the statistics would be given by this particular power law scaling. Okay, so since the focus of this is to actually characterize these statistics in a model agnostic way, we're going to look at 3 very different models and essentially analytically compute the statistics of the spikes. But we need to make certain technical assumptions to make the analysis tractable. So for starters, we'll still focus on a measurement operator that corresponds to the projector to the south pole of the Bloch sphere. And so the dynamics in that case would correspond to, in this intermittent resets to the south pole of the Bloch sphere. So the jump stochastic master equation is given by this form, where the red part corresponds to a deterministic flow in the dynamics, and this purple or blue part corresponds to a reset, right? So, and this resetting rate is given by some kind of the expectation value of the Poisson increment. Or the of some interest is resetting dynamics, and this has been studied independently of quantum systems and quantum trajectories. There's a very huge flurry of activity in that field. It's been going on since 2011, after the seminal paper by Evans, Majumdar, where they looked at random walks which are intermittently reset to a certain point, and they show that by tuning this resetting rate, you can optimize the first passage times. And there are a whole host of interesting phenomena that happen for those kind of systems. Here, of course, the resetting rate is not independently tuned. It's given by the state, the quantum state itself. So it's not an independent parameter in your dynamics. And there's a very nice review by Evans, Majumdar, and Sher that goes into all this interesting phenomena in detail in 2020. This is of interest to us because there's a rather powerful approach in basically solving the stochastic dynamics of with resetting, termed as the renewal approach, where you can compute probability distributions by expressing them as convolutions of the propagators of the process without resetting, of resetting-free propagators. So this underpins the analytic tractability of looking at dynamics with stochastic resetting, which is why we chose this particular measurement operator. There are other measurement operators also that correspond to resetting, but this is just one of those operators. And so this is essentially what underpins analytic tractability, that you finally are boiling it down to a piecewise deterministic Markov process with resetting. And additional assumptions will be made to make sure it's a 1D process, because that also was necessary for our analysis to really work, that it had to be a 1D stochastic process. So we'll set up our models accordingly, okay? So consider the case where you have a driving field, and of course you can write a time-independent Hamiltonian by going to the rotating frame and then applying the rotating wave approximation. So the assumptions that will lead this dynamics being a 1D Markov piecewise deterministic process with resetting would be that to consider fully efficient measurements. Eta is the detection efficiency of your probe, and an initial state that restricts the dynamics to a great circle on the Bloch sphere. So essentially you will have some kind of, so you have the state on the Bloch sphere, and there's a particular great circle on this Bloch sphere. So for initial states on this particular great circle, you will have the dynamics being restricted to this particular great circle with an angle that's spanned, angle theta, that goes from minus pi to pi. Okay, so all the dynamics is given by this particular angle theta, and so here you see this theta, the evolution for this theta, and the dn corresponds to resetting to the south pole of the Bloch sphere again by theta is equal to pi. Okay, and this exact model has been studied multiple times in the literature. This I think first introduced by Schnisko and collaborators, and then there's been another alternative study from the perspective of stochastic resetting by Dubé and collaborators, and yeah, so this is of some interest. That has been already of some interest already. If I were to plot the typical trajectories of the dynamical equation I just showed you, you would see that for weak measurement rates, you can see this very clear flow plus reset structure. You keep resetting back to theta is equal to pi, and these correspond to those jagged edges you see in the plot, in the first plot. And as you go from left to right, you're increasing the measurement strength, and you see the emergent jumps and the spiking process up here. Now, a key point here is that you have only one-sided spiking process, and you can easily see by just working out from the dynamics, this is because we have restricted our dynamics to be that of resetting. So we are looking at trajectories with resetting, and for trajectories with resetting, you always get a one-sided spiking process, which is different from what typically you would see for a more general measurement operator. Yeah, and one subtlety which I think I'm obliged to mention is that we are kind of cheating a little bit in the sense that if we just carelessly increase the measurement strength to make it very large, you will essentially see the Zeno effect, and you will see basically confinement to a particular point on the Bloch sphere. So to circumvent that, you have to rescale the term in the Rabbi Hamiltonian and increase it in a commensurate fashion to avoid the suppression effects due to the Zeno effect. Okay, so the second setup, which we're considering independently of the first, is by coupling the qubit to a thermal bath, and this is of maybe a little more interest because here no such rescaling has to be done. You basically have a bath with some transition rates. So this basically, you can get this thermal invariant by the Bond Markov approximation. And we are assuming that the transition rates satisfy detailed balance. So we take these transition rates where n bar is your thermal occupation number. And again, remember the agenda with all these models is to make assumptions or just restrict your dynamics such that you get a 1D process, and we get an autonomous equation in the population Q, different from the theta we saw earlier. We are talking only about the population Q. And of course, the coherences are not much of interest. So the dynamics of the coherences are trivial. And this is the effective equation for the population. And again, if I look at the typical trajectories from left to right, I'm increasing the gamma. Again, I get a one-sided spiking process. This time the reset is to Q is equal to 0. And it's essentially qualitatively very similar to what we saw in the Rabbi case, except that now we're looking at populations, and the point of resetting instead of theta is equal to pi is Q is equal to 0. Okay, and the final model we'll be looking at is that of adding a complementary measurement operator. So we obviously have V or V1. Now I'm labeling it V1 to avoid confusion, which is your projector to the south pole of the Bloch sphere, and some other measurement operator V2, which I think corresponds to the spontaneous emission operator, or the corresponding to the spontaneous emission dynamics. And these forms are, useful in the way because they yield again an autonomous equation in the population QT, just like the thermal case, and you get this equation. And essentially, the only difference now is that you have two stochastic terms instead of one. So you just got to keep track of that. And if you plot the triple trajectories again, you'll see that there's one point that both operators correspond to a resetting. The first operator corresponds to resetting to the south pole of the Bloch sphere. The second one corresponds to, I guess, north pole. Sorry, not north pole. North pole of the Bloch sphere. So they reset to two opposite points. But the danger with this second resetting, the resetting correspond to V2, is that the Q is equal to 1 is like an absorbing point in your dynamics. Okay, so you see spikes in a transient way, and then eventually your state goes to Q is equal to 1, and then you see nothing. It's just frozen there. So an absorbing point for spiking dynamics, you need to ignore those trajectories which have a click or a reset of corresponding to V2. Okay, so these are just some technicalities, I guess. These are not very interesting, just details, just to lay some of the groundwork for our analysis. Yeah, sure, okay. So we basically perform the analysis, we perform this counting, and as I mentioned, the renewal approach gives you the ability to find the distribution of these spikes, distribution of the spikes analytically, and this essentially is our result. We see certain this model agnostic power law statistics, but the main thing that I wanted to the agenda behind this talk was to talk about experimental aspects, because as I mentioned at the start of the talk is what do we do with them? What do we do with these spikes, And the open question is, can we detect them experimentally? So I'll just try to do a quick discussion of rather interesting experiments, which basically this experiment by the group at Yale, led by Zlatko Minev, where the idea was that they could achieve the resolution of individual photon clicks by monitoring the occupation of level B via a cavity. And essentially, you see the readout of this photon count from that cavity. And they were able to infer which state was in B and which state was not in B based on that, whether the photon count was high or low. And the idea was, whenever you have a lull, basically a sequence of a region, so basically a click here corresponds to a B to G transition, which means that your photon count goes from a low photon count to a high photon count. And essentially a click corresponds to a B to G transition. So the idea was that when you have a sequence of no clicks, the transition, the atom was undergoing a jump from G to D. Now, okay, so I'll just go to the real meat of this idea. So when you talk about detecting spikes experimentally, I think the important point to understand is that we need to look at some kind of, say, some occupation of some level. And we need to monitor this, essentially look at these fluctuations, right? So now the condition for seeing spikes experimentally is that you should be able to do this without relying on a stochastic master equation, because if you just take the experimental readout and you try to find the state condition on these measurement outcomes and generate this skew, time trace of the skew, then it's no different from what you're doing numerically. So if you actually want to experimentally determine to detect spikes, you need to be able to do it without the aid of a stochastic master equation. Now, if you have to just take one takeaway from my talk, it is this, that spikes are interrupted jumps, and we know precisely the path that a quantum jump takes in the Hilbert space. And so these jumps can be interrupted by clicks, and they form spikes. And essentially, from just the statistics of these clicks and this data I've shown you on the plot, you should be able to infer the heights of these spikes and essentially verify those power law statistics experimentally. So the bottom line is, we are not relying on the stochastic master equation. We're relying just on experimental data, the click sequences, and this tomographically reconstructed probability of occupation between the levels G and D. And we are using the fact that these are getting interrupted by these clicks, we are essentially determining the heights of the spikes. So that is how our proposal is based on. I'm so sorry I'm going over time, but yeah, I guess I'll just leave it at the summary slide.
Okay, let's thank Alan for this talk. We have, yeah.
Thanks for the nice talk. I was wondering, do you see statistics other than Poissonian in any of the cases? Like, for example, if you have resonant fluorescence, then quantum jumps can be sub-Poissonian.
I see.
So
we looked at a very restricted class of trajectories, where the noise was Poissonian. So okay. I think you're talking about something like a heterodyne measurement?
No, with quantum jump measurements. Okay. Yeah.
I see. Okay. No, we haven't looked into that, I think.
Okay.
Our model is based on a qubit coupled to another qubit, and essentially the two outcomes, DM0 and DM1, corresponds to the state of the qubit anyway. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay. Are there any further questions?
Yeah. I'm trying to understand what you said about the last point, right? So you're so in this so here you seem to say that the spikes have a finite duration, which is so here in this experiment, the duration of the jump corresponds to the time during which there is no click.
Exactly.
So are you saying that the spikes have a finite time?
Right. So yes, we can never go to the infinite measurement strength limit. So we're always in some finite measurement strength. And for finite measurement strength, the spikes have some finite width. Okay, it's only in the infinite measurement strength process where they become these very sharp lines. So this experiment is able to tell in real time when you're in a quantum jump, and that is when the time scale between the clicks exceeds this delta T mid, which is around 4 microseconds for the parameter that Michel and collaborators used. So essentially our prescription would be, if your clicks are separated more by 4 microseconds, but less than the time taken for the jump to be completed, it would correspond to what is like a spike, which in the stronger measurement rate becomes more and more sharper. So yeah. So
okay. Thanks. Okay. So in the interest of time, let's again thank Alan for this talk. And